78 degrees, the temperature reading in Chicago. The time now, 9:30.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Rudolph Ganz speaking. At the end of my first radio half-hour last Sunday, I just had begun telling the story of the vitamin BACH, otherwise Bach, when the producer signaled, "Time is up." So I feel somewhat obliged to repeat the little incident and complete the story by letting you know the point of it. It was at the New York Philharmonic Young People's Concert. I had the pleasure of conducting those concerts for 10 years. I just had performed with the orchestra 2 Bach chorales, beautifully orchestrated by Leopold Stokowski. And I was amazed with the repercussion with the young audience. There was enormous applause, which naturally pleased me a great deal. And I took the opportunity of saying, "My young friends, please remember all your life, Bach is the vitamin of music." And then came some 20, 30 letters from mothers asking me, where can we buy the vitamin BACH? Because the boys insisted upon procuring it. So this is the story. The title of last week's broadcast was The Old and the New. I contrasted Bach with Honegger, Rameau with Scriabin, and Scarlatti with the American Schumann, one N in the Schumann. Tonight, I shall for a few moments continue the same formula, let you hear some early Russian music climaxed with one of the last works of Alexander Nikolaevich Scriabin, a small but epoch-making prelude in which, as far as I know, the major and minor triad appeared together for the first time in music. It was the marriage of major and minor, and they never divorced since. I trust that you will be interested in this opening of tonight's radio half-hour, especially as I shall have the pleasure and privilege to introduce to you later on one of the outstanding composers of the present era, my much admired and very dear friend, Alexander Tcherepnin. I shall invite him to tell us of some of his secrets of craftsmanship, of his latest composition, and also of his recent European and American successes. But first let us go back to the 19th century and meet the pianistic giant Anton Rubinstein, who died in 1894, in one of his best-known piano pieces, the Romance in E-flat major. It was one of the most popular examples of somewhat sentimental expression, though it is written thoroughly professionally. Everybody played it, no doubt, with the entire gamut from tepid to consuming warmth, and it was arranged for every possible combination of instruments and vocal groups. People call it now trite, so it must have been awfully good once upon a time. And here is the romance of Anton Rubinstein. And now to the great figure in the music world of the last generation, Serge Rachmaninoff. I had the privilege of enjoying his friendship. I played his Titanic Second Sonata, his second piano concerto. I conducted his Second Symphony, The Island of the Dead. But outstanding among my cherished memories is my having conducted with him at the piano 2 performances of his Second Concerto during my reign as conductor of the St. Louis Symphony Orchestra. It was an unforgettable thrill. When I was a student at the conservatory in Lausanne, a dear friend of ours who married a well-known Russian businessman and lived in Moscow came back to Lausanne and brought back with her the 5 early piano pieces Rachmaninoff wrote at the age of 18, among them the Prelude. I'm going to play for you the sister to this Prelude, a melody in E major, which I consider one of the very charming works of the early Rachmaninoff. At least I was the first one to play these early works, already decidedly Rachmaninoff-ish in Switzerland before I was 20. So here is the melody in E major, and played from the early Russian edition in its original form, which I prefer to the revised and unnecessarily complicated new version. And now the 1-minute prelude by Scriabin from his last period of writing. The major chord and the minor chord, and that's where they met. The first time I met major and minor in a work by Tcherepnin, I had a very remarkable experience. The violins, second violins, play and the violas play. And so when I began conducting this, with the melody sung by the first violins, and that was at the Philharmonic, at the New York Philharmonic. And I stopped because many of the players were looking at me with astonishment. I said, "What happened?" "Oh, they are playing F sharp and we are playing F natural." "Yes, what's wrong?" "All right, let us try it." "Now let us try the minor." "Now which one do you like best?" They all answered, "When both are playing." And nobody has been divorced since. Major and minor are good when they are together. It is now my genuine pleasure to introduce to you one of the great figures of the present, the so-called contemporary group of creative masters of music, Alexander Tcherepnin. Do you remember, Sasha, how we met in Paris at Isidore Philippe's? The thrilling experience I had. I arrived at the apartment expecting to take our mutual friend Philippe for dinner, and I heard somebody play the piano. It was so interesting that I did not ring the bell, but waited and waited. I began to figure, now whose music is this? It isn't Rachmaninoff, it isn't Medtner, it isn't Prokofiev, and by all means not Khachaturian. Now who is it? Then I rang the bell, and Isidore Philippe said, "Oh, I'm so glad you come early, because I want you to know Alexander Tcherepnin." And here he was, this handsome young man, having played some of his compositions for Philippe and now playing them for me. And what I heard was his own music, different from all those we know. So I bless that moment, because our friendship since then has been just a beautiful one, and I'm very proud of it.
Oh, truly, you know, Rudy, I must say, there are some friends in life, you meet them and you love them, but there are true friends that are so very few, and you are a true friend, And you proved to me more than on any occasion. You know, when I was in trouble, you saved me from trouble. When I need your help, you help me. So I must say you are the greatest person I know, greatest artist, greatest human in all respects.
Now I feel terribly embarrassed. Thank you
it's
very
true
much.
What I am saying this.
Thank you very much. You see, you heard me play that little 1-minute piece of Scriabin in which I personally believe major and minor met for the first time. They were married that day and never divorced, according to the book. But you had invented your own scale, which included major and minor. And I wish you would say a word how you created that scale, your own scale, from the 7 notes of the former one.
You see, I did not specifically invent this by analysis or by any kind of speculation. But when, after having composed instinctively when I was a young boy, I started to analyze my own composition, I found this tendency towards major and minor. And I started to find out what was the inner law that dictated that. And so I found that somehow the compositions that I have composed without thinking of anything are based not on a diatonic scale, not on any mode, but on a combination of major and minor, and with some extra notes that are by no way appoggiaturas, but regular notes of a scale. So came to life this 9-step scale that came more out of instinct, but later on became somehow theorized, if you can.
That's very interesting, because naturally we have so many different ways of producing music. I mean, how do you feel about polytonal, which is naturally a little old-fashioned by this time? You believe that it had a right to exist for some time?
I think that any music that has talent has right to exist, but I do not believe too much in too much speculation. And here I must tell you a little story that happened to me. When I was in Boston, I visited my friend Slonimsky, and he asked me to write something in his book as a souvenir. And so I went through the book, and I saw the Prokofiev's writing. And here I read, it was in Russian, and it was, in English translation, it would mean, let's send all the theories to the grandma, let's start to compose music. I must say it corresponds exactly to how I feel.
That's wonderful. Well now, and how about the old 12th tone?
I would send them also to grandma. They belong already. By the way, excuse me. And I wrote now a piece, I wrote a piece for children that is based on a 12-tone series. I call this Killjoy.
I believe with you. Maybe Grandma is trying to dispose of them at the present time. So, I mean, there does not necessarily be a certain style, and you said it yourself, there be music.
I believe in music more than in any kind of ways, specific ways, expression that you impose on yourself a priori.
Yeah. Would you say that you found difficulty with critics to appreciate your style, or was there a certain appreciation immediately?
I must say, I learned a lot from critics. And I have books where I have critics, whatever they write, good, bad, and from bad critics, naturally, I learn more than from good, because we artists live in sort of green room where everyone comes and shake our hands and say, oh, how good you are. And then suddenly you receive a good beating in a critic, then it is quite of an interesting situation. But I must tell you something that might perhaps, cheer up many people. I think that when life comes to a certain degree, you find that you have an equal amount of bad and good critics about one and the same composition and about one and the same playing.
But don't you believe it is rather important who writes? I have heard so very often when somebody said, oh, I had a marvelous notice in Mannheim in Germany, who wrote it? I must have the guarantee that the critic is able to write with knowledge.
Actually what they have in Moscow, they have instead of criticism in newspapers, they have a blackboard, and at that blackboard, anyone who was in hall can write what he thinks. And what he thinks is communicated to the artist. So I recognize right to anyone in the hall to write and express his opinion publicly, because we are playing not for one or other, we're playing for all those people. So a critic naturally is the most qualified person to express his opinion, but at any rate, I do not feel that there must be specific qualification or super doctor's degree in order to criticize us.
How about the premiere of your Fourth Symphony in Boston? You were present. I think you flew over here just for that.
That's
and flew
right.
back again.
Yes, that's Mr.
And were you
was kind
perfectly
to invite
satisfied with the performance?
Oh, it was wonderful performance. Really, I must say, I cried during the rehearsal, so I had to take my handkerchief out because I was so touched.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, isn't that wonderful? And we are going to hear it next season here, I'm sure, but we are going to hear it first of all in Ravinia.
That's what I
Aren't
hear,
we?
yes.
Yes.
Mr. Munch gave this waiver specifically for Ravinia for his friend, Mr. Henry.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. And tell me, is the opera finished that Kusevitsky Foundation asked you to write?
You know, the story is that the libretto has to be finished first. I compose lots of music, but I have not enough librettists. So if by any chance among those listeners there is one who can give me a hand to help me with the libretto, he is welcome, and please come.
Maybe, is there anybody in the audience who would like to undertake this?
I have the libretto, only it has to be worked and arranged. So please, it's an invitation.
Well,
Thank
and
you.
then I want to thank you for being with us this evening.
And thank you for asking me to come.
Well, no,
I am really touched.
well, thank you very
Nothing
much.
could give me more pleasure than to be with you.
Well, thank you.
These evenings with Rudolph Ganz feature music and conversation with the internationally known composer, conductor, pianist, and teacher. Be sure to join us again next Sunday for another Evening with Rudolph Ganz, presented by the Public Affairs Department of WBBM in cooperation with Roosevelt University. This program is produced and directed by Len Schlosser. CBS Chicago, the WBBM Air Theater.